the event. Mesdames et messieurs, votre attention s'il vous plaît. Nous vous souhaitons la bienvenue au siège de l'UNESCO. Pour le bon déroulement de cette manifestation, mais aussi votre sécurité, merci de prêter attention aux consignes suivantes. Si une évacuation générale est nécessaire, vous en serez averti par une sirène d'alarme associée à un message d'alerte. Vous devrez quitter la salle dans le calme, par les sorties de secours situées sur votre droite et derrière vous. Afin de faciliter cette évacuation, nous vous demandons de ne pas encombrer les couloirs et les zones de circulation pendant cette manifestation. Le point de rassemblement se trouve à l'extérieur du bâtiment. Nous vous remercions de votre attention et vous souhaitons une belle manifestation.
Hello, welcome to all of you, welcome to UNESCO. We are all very excited that today we are launching the inaugural Albert Hirschman Lecture at UNESCO in honor of Albert Hirschman. And I'm Gustavo Merino, I'm Director for Social Policies here at the Social and Human Sciences sector. And it's really a very exciting moment, and we are very lucky to have with us Professor Daron Acemoglu of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who will be giving this inaugural lecture. And without further ado, I would like to welcome and invite Gabriela Ramos, the Assistant Director General of the Social and Human Sciences sector, here to say some welcoming words. Thank you.
Well, this is amazing. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming, member states. Thank you for coming from all over Palace, from all over the world. Welcome, Professor Acemoglu. Great to have you. Great to have the family of Albert Hirschman. What a privilege. And I have to say, as Gustavo Merino said, this is a very important moment in the life of UNESCO. We are launching this lecture on the name of Mr. Albert Hirschman, and we're doing it with a renowned professor of MIT. You all know him because you all came to listen to him. But I want to tell you that besides having this lecture and being the inaugural lecture for this very important event, we do it with the family. And I really appreciate that, because I would say in the best Hirschman style, this will be the way to do it. I want to thank my dear friend Mario Pezzini, who was the brain behind, and also Simon Ray to help us put this together, and of course, the teams in the MOST program, the Managing of Social Transformation. This lecture brings back the inspiration that UNESCO founding fathers and mothers, because there was one mother, good, the UK ambassador, had when they created this organization. The institution that was going to be in charge of education, culture, and science should be the place where open and contrasting debate of ideas should take place to find better ways for humanity to address the many challenges. And I think this continues to be the case today. In this long tradition, UNESCO was the very first place where Claude Lévi-Strauss delivered his seminal work stating that there were no hierarchy of races, there was one human race. It was also the place where Margaret Mead delineated the responsibility argument very long ago when dealing with climate change, demography, or wars. And more recently, in the age of AI, Daniel Innerarity delivered his fantastic work on the impact of unrestricted artificial intelligence on democratic processes and dialogue. But now we're taking this role to a higher level. And this is done in the house that hosts the social and human sciences, the management of social transformation programs. And just think about it, when I arrived as an ADG in UNESCO, and I found that I was going to be in charge of the program on managing of social transformation, it tells you everything, because it's not about growth, it's not about income, it's not about levers or technology, it's about societies, and how do we deal with them. So this is why we are so glad to have a lecture named after Albert Hirschman. Albert Hirschman was not only a pioneering thinker in the social sciences and development economics, but also a figure of profound personal courage, distinguished by his unwavering progressive convictions and his deep bias for hope. His influence is evident in major political and economic endeavors, such as the Marshall Plan, nothing less, nothing more, and other development strategies, exactly because his vision of the world, and therefore his work, exerted this courage to transcend from borders, disciplines, and cultures. And I think this is really important in the life we are doing now. Mario and Katia will say some words to introduce this very important element of why we are naming this Albert Hirschman lecture. So I will give them the floor soon. But this is also the reason why we are truly excited to launch this initiative and pay further homage to Albert Hirschman with a lecture on technological progress by Professor Daron Acemoglu. Who better than him to illuminate the path of innovative thinking? His groundbreaking work underscores the vital importance of inclusive institutions. It also highlights how extractive institutions, which concentrate power and wealth in the hands of a few, undermine the well-being of all stakeholders, from governments and business and individuals. We need this new thinking. At a moment where, at least in the policy field in many countries, we seem to be incapable to think out of the box, and therefore incapable to change. And this is a service that I feel, and I'm sure that member states that are here with us agree, that UNESCO can provide. The analytical economic frameworks we have relied on for decades have not sufficiently evolved to meet the challenges of our time, failing to grasp the interconnectedness, the resilience, the complexity, and therefore we need to consider some new ways of addressing the issues. And the reasons for change are pressing. I'm not going to go into long list, but we know that the rate of war now, and our thoughts are for all those people that are suffering the conditions of war, are really not since World War II. Our planet resources are being unsustainably exploited, and the greatest challenge of our lifetime, inequality of income and opportunities within and between countries, remain staggering. Millions of people lack jobs and opportunities, while the 10% wealthiest individuals hold more wealth than the bottom 3.1 billion people worldwide. These are data that we can say very fast, but it's telling us why politics are unsustainable, societies are unsustainable, and then the issue of artificial intelligence that also threatens to contribute to this trend, and where Professor Acemoglu has really looked at different ways of handling it and probably to change in his very fantastic research on power and progress done with Simon Johnston. So we need change, and we need to be capable of imagining different futures and that we can build them. So without any further ado, I hope that this occasion, with this very first inaugural Albert Hirschman Lecture, will provide you with food for thought, will provide you with new ways, new angles, and will help us imagine better futures. So Mario, if you want to come in with Katia and share with our audience why we really thought about having Professor Hirschman, and then, well, Katia, you will come later. So we give the floor to Mario, and then we will have Katia. Mario, by the way, is senior counselor of the Social and Human Sciences, but he was the director of the Development Center at OECD with so many contributions. Mario, the floor is yours.
Well, you have seen Gabriela Ramos, which is a builder of multinationalism. The efforts she's putting in creating opportunities and moment for debate is incredible. I will call it a locomotive. And one day, Gabriela tells me, I think we need absolutely to build something about thought leaders. We need to convey, as it was the case in the past in UNESCO, important thinker, as Daron, for example. When she told me this story, immediately came to my mind the idea to invent something devoted to Albert Otto Hirschman. And you may ask why. Obviously, you have already heard a series of explanations from Gabriela: multidisciplinarity, development economics. I would also add political initiative. You can see some traces of his incredible efforts, a personality that moved across last century in unbelievable ways that I perceive very close to the story also of my family. There is, by the way, a series that is called Transatlantic that you can see even on Netflix, but also something that Terry Damisch have done as a documentary. Well, in reality, instead of telling you all these general words, I want to concentrate on a personal reason. Between the two Punic Wars, I was a student of economics myself, and at a certain point, I encountered something absolutely illuminating. In this flat panorama of economics and mathematics very often, I jumped on a test that was titled Obstacle to the Perception of Change. And this was illuminating for many reasons, and I will share with you two of those reasons. The first is introduced by a joke that Albert Hirschman uses in this article that I invite everybody, of course, to read. It is about two persons that meet, and one tells to the other, Paul, it has been many years, but I remember you were tall, now you are small, you were fat, and now you are thin. And the other goes, sorry, but my name is not Paul. So you have changed so much, even the name. It was illuminating because it tells us a lot of things about perception and how perception may become a strong obstacle to change. And this is my first point. We are, as the Grand Continent has written several times here, there is Pierre that can report to you, in a kind of interreign. It's a category of Antonio Gramsci that used to say there are moments in history in which the old is still there, but is not useful anymore. And the new is not coming. And between these two moments, monsters may appear. Of course, Antonio Gramsci was thinking about fascism. He died in a prison of fascists. But this moment can repeat themselves. And in a certain sense, today, we are still under the influence of a prevailing ideology that we should dismantle, but is still there. And we continue to perceive the reality with all category, whilst the world is changing. So I think that Albert Hirschman can absolutely help us to dismantle the fog of past ideology and open our mind. Do you want example? It's very easy. How many times we have heard about the polycrisis? We are in a phase of polycrisis, and we just sum one problem to the other without any efforts to explain, for example, how much this polycrisis starts in 2008, and the crisis that show that the neoliberal thinking of all the previous decade is simply wrong. And therefore we need to rethink and to rebuild a new conceptual framework. But another example is what we are seeing in these days. There is to have, again, anti-cyclical macroeconomic policies that obviously will bring us back to what we have seen 10 and 15 years ago. So I think Hirschman must help us to dismantle this obstacle that do not allow us to see that the change is there and is needed. But obstacle to the perception of change. Here comes the second point. There are many experiences in the world, many new ideas, many new innovations that are not visible because we pretend that we have clear information, transparent, but we know very little in reality. And we should give hope to these different experiments and build also a multilateral experimentalism by capturing all these innovations that exist in the world. Albert Hirschman very often spoke about possibilism. There is not just black and white. There are different possibilities to reform and therefore justification for action. Inside multilateralism, inside the world, inside the local places, as well as the national places. And we see that there is a strong demand for voice from all this experience and from people. The discontent that we have been appearing in many parts of the world is very often a demand for voice. We do not only vote with our feet, moving from one country to another. We sometimes want to have a voice, a table where to express this voice. And I think that Gabriela offered us a great opportunity to build those tables, among other things, with the Albert Hirschman Lecture. Thank you very much. I give the floor now to Kat.
Good afternoon, or good evening. Thank you, UNESCO, and thank you, Gabriela Ramos and Mario Pezzini. On behalf of our family, for having developed this idea to name a yearly lecture after my father, Albert Hirschman. In these few words, I shall try to give you a feeling for who he was and why he would have been very sensitive to this honor. Firstly, and especially today with the world in turmoil, I am sure he would feel, as our family does, that it is a privilege to be in this building where 194 member states work to promote for world peace and security through culture, education, and the sciences. As you at UNESCO, my father believed the best source of information was on the ground, in dialogue with the people, to better understand their history, traditions, and how each culture envisioned their own ideas about development. Also about problem solving, and then the path to their desired future. Even before he wrote his book, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, he was convinced of the importance of voice, as Mario just said, in all exchanges. Could one in fact say that here at UNESCO, voice is one of your principal tools? Secondly, he was resolutely turned toward an effort to bring the human factor, even each individual's feelings, into the study of economics. He was attentive to differences, never afraid to depart from the rigid paths traced by established ideas. He found inspiration not only from the people he met, but also from their cultural heritage, which he mingled with his own. Thus, in his work, he develops an argument or clarifies an idea by calling upon poets, novelists, essayists, who come from a great diversity of horizons. To name a few, from Garcia Marquez to Kafka, from William Blake to Cervantes and to Goethe. I must mention here that a rich and intense dialogue with his wife, my mother, Sarah, was essential, notably thanks to her keen critical spirit and her knowledge and love of philosophy and literature. She, in fact, developed a wonderful program called People and Stories, Gente y Cuentos, where literature is shared with all, and especially with those who had little or no access. So that's also linked to UNESCO. Thirdly, as you at UNESCO, he had to confront his theories with a constantly changing world. He enjoyed complexity, and he was never afraid to revisit his theories, questioning or qualifying and deepening them. In this sense, he had great intellectual courage. This was a continuum of his physical courage, which my sister Lisa and I witnessed in everyday life when we were children. We were convinced that he was the very bravest of fathers, killing a threatening snake, driving us through torrents of rain, and through a falling mountain in Colombia, and of course, much more. This physical courage stemmed from his experience as a young man. He put his life on the line, fighting fascism in any way he could, in undercover activities and through his engagement in 3 armies. This fight against all fascisms and for social justice continued throughout his life, sheltering and supporting those who were in danger. UNESCO's mission to promote peace through the sharing of cultures and knowledge in an is an incredibly strong moral commitment. This lecture, named for Albert Hirschman, will hopefully contribute ideas and accompany you in the continued accomplishment of your work. My father believed deeply that morality should be central to the work of the social scientist. He wrote the following in chapter 14 of his book, Essays in Trespassing, and I quote, "Morality is not like pollution abatement, that can be secured by slightly modifying the design of a policy proposal. Rather, it belongs into the center of our work, and it can get there only if the social scientists are morally alive and make themselves vulnerable to moral concerns. Down the road, it is then possible to visualize a kind of social science that would be a moral social science, where moral considerations are not repressed or kept apart, but are systematically commingled with analytic argument, where the transition from preaching to proving and back again is performed frequently and with ease, and where moral considerations are displayed openly and disarmingly. Such would be, in part, my dream for a social science for our grandchildren. Albert Hirschman's dream is in your hands here at UNESCO, and with his grandchildren and great-grandchildren who are here in this room. Thank you.
I actually would like to ask the Hirschman family to stand so everybody can see you. You know that we have economists in the group, so you never know. They were first here at UNESCO, so. And now, without any further ado, really thank you for this message. I think it was so important to remind us why we named this the Albert Hirschman Lecture. But then, as I said at the beginning, no one better than Professor Acemoglu to honor this name, but also to bring his wisdom to this room. I know you will say he doesn't need introduction, but I'm going to make a little comment just for the sake. We're actually betting that he needs to be the next Nobel Prize, but okay, we'll see. Currently an institute professor at MIT, he has made exceptional empirical and theoretical contributions to our understanding of how inclusive institutions can foster growth and innovation and the critical interactions between the state and society for liberty and shared prosperity. His thought leadership spans wide-reaching and profound topics on political economy, labor economics, and macroeconomics. Maria Gracia, who's here with us, she also says that he can model everything, so that's amazing. It's not only the quantitative issues, but things that we cannot even measure, so amazing. And he's known also for his co-authorship of Why Nations Fall, The Narrow Corridor, and the recently published Power and Progress, which examines the social, political, economic implications of unregulated technologies on society, notably AI. And I want to recognize our member states because actually you were also the ones that gave us this mandate on the ethics of AI. As Katia says, the moral ground, the ethical ground, don't leave them out, is not an afterthought. And in addition to his remarkable body of work, Professor Acemoglu has been honored with numerous awards, including the John Bates Clark Medal, the Nemers Prize in Economics, and most recently, the prestigious ASK International Social Science Award. And today, his lecture continues to guide us in our reflection on the global effort to prosperity, asking, can technological progress build shared prosperity? And so, welcome, Professor Daron Acemoglu.
Thank you very much, Gabriela, and welcome, or pleased to have you here, the whole Hirschman family. It's very meaningful for me to give the inaugural Hirschman Lecture, following perhaps in the footsteps of that great social scientist. So, and I think, as Gabriela said, the issue of technological progress and what it implies for humanity in general, I think, is in the minds of many people right now, perhaps everybody, given the very rapid advances, but also very disruptive advances that we're going through. So this is a topic that I want to talk about. Let's see whether the presentation. Okay, all right, let me go back. Okay. So I'm going to talk about, can technological progress build shared prosperity? Or perhaps the question should be, when can technological progress build shared prosperity? And in doing this, I'm going to draw from the most recent book I wrote, which Gabriela very kindly mentioned, with Simon Johnson, Power and Progress. That's the US edition there. The reason why we are so obsessed with technological progress today is not hard to understand. Much of humanity lives lives that are so much healthier, prosperous, and comfortable relative to what people were used to 300 years ago, that it's not hard to be impressed by the gifts that technology and innovation have brought. But what I'm going to argue is that that macro picture hides much more interesting variation that has important lessons for today. In the history of technological progress and the prosperity that it has brought, at least to some people, to a lot of people, over the last 300 years, not much is automatic or inevitable. It depends critically on institutions and the type of technological progress and who controls technological progress. And those are questions that become even more central in the age of innovation, or at least what some people view as the age of innovation, where we are surrounded by new AI products, new apps, new widgets every day. And according to most statistical measures of innovation, for example, patents, there has really been a true explosion. So here I'm showing you what the US patent data shows, and there has been a fourfold increase from the early 1980s to today, and even more notably, this has been driven by what many people view as foundational sectors that are about communication, information technology, electronics, on which many other activities in the economy build. And of course today, AI and generative AI that have captured imaginations on both sides of the Atlantic. But if you think people are becoming obsessed with AI here, just like look at the United States, where the level of excitement has reached fever pitch. But in this age of innovation, AI breakthroughs, mesmerizing technological advances, the questions that I think are in the minds of many of you in this room are still central. Who will benefit from these technologies? Will they bring shared prosperity, which very clearly relate to the question of who actually controls these technologies? These issues are central partly because if you look at history, you will see very clear lines connecting the control of technologies to how the benefits of technologies are distributed and whether actually they bring any benefits at all. Those issues should be much more central in public discussions and in economics. But there is a sort of folk theorem in economics, which, like most folk theorems, has a grain of truth and a lot of simplification or untruth in it. And it has colored, together with other things, together with other structural sources of techno-optimism, the way that many people, policymakers, journalists, opinion makers around the world and in the United States think about technological progress and AI. It is also often the case that with folk theorems, they are part of the culture, part of the folklore, so they don't even have a name. So Simon and I gave it a name, and we called it the productivity bandwagon. The productivity bandwagon claims that there is an automatic process via which technological advances will bring a type of shared prosperity. If indeed this productivity bandwagon is true, it doesn't obviate the need to ask some of the questions about who will control the technology, who will benefit more, or who might benefit a little less. But fundamentally, we shouldn't be afraid of technology. We should welcome it with open arms because there are strong forces towards a type of tide lifting all boats. So what is this productivity bandwagon? Well, I know I had the pleasure of meeting several students from Sorbonne earlier on. I'm sure this is like what you learn in undergraduate and in graduate studies. Technology improves, so our knowledge and our capability to do things improve. We apply to the production process, so we don't build just nuclear weapons or killing tools, but we apply to the production process. When we do that, then productivity rises, meaning that we can get more output, more goods and services from the same inputs because we have better capabilities, better knowledge, better technology. And then from there on, there is a set of forces that lead to improvements for workers as well in terms of higher wages and earning potential. And that's critical because most of us still earn most of our income from the labor market. So if the labor market is buoyant, wages are high, that becomes a powerful foundation for shared prosperity. So why is it that there is this arrow from productivity increasing to workers benefiting? Well, we could also question technology improves and productivity rises as well, because we do have instances where improved knowledge is used for other things than increasing productivity. But let's leave that aside. I think that's more clearly understood by everybody. But let's focus on this: productivity rises and workers also benefit. So here is the basic economic argument. When firms, companies, can produce more, they want to expand and they want to hire more labor so that they can produce more. That then increases their demand for labor, and through the labor market processes, those lead to higher wages. So if you think about that, there are two claims in that statement. One, that as productivity increases, firms will want to hire more labor. And second, that this demand for labor somehow translates to higher wages. So both of those are not unreasonable. And if you are so inclined, you can go and find plenty of examples in the historical record, including recent 20th century, where both of these do work. So higher productivity somehow leads to greater demand for labor, and greater demand for labor translates into higher wages. But as it happens, if you are also inclined otherwise, you could find examples in history that contradict each one of these channels, and that's what I'm going to try to first explicate, because I want to understand when is it that this shared prosperity mechanism works. So let me start by the second hypothesis, that higher labor demand translates into higher wages. And I have two examples here, I could come up with more, which are, for their day, for their age, perhaps as significant as the digital technological breakthroughs that we're experiencing today. On the left, the big technological advance of the Middle Ages, which were, by the way, dark in some ways, but they weren't dark technologically. So there were a lot of technological improvements, especially in agriculture. But this one stands out. Windmills really changed the production process in many different dimensions, increasing productivity in some tasks perhaps more than tenfold, perhaps as much as 20-fold. What happened? Well, it turns out that the nobility and the high clergy reaped all the benefits and not much improvements in the livelihood of the peasants. And when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, because the peasants were in a coercive relationship in the process of serfdom and other obligations that they had to pay to landowners, which were heavily the nobility and the clergy. But even more importantly, perhaps in the case of the windmills, those windmills were completely monopolized by the same landowners, and they were also able to prevent anybody coming with a competitive pressure on them to open their own windmills, or even sometimes compel people to use their windmills. Under such conditions, the kind of competitive labor market processes that would be necessary for higher labor demand to translate into higher wages is not going to work necessarily. The second is an even sharper example. It's the cotton gin. This is the Eli Whitney version, but there were several others. In the 18th century, the US South, well, the mid-18th century, the US South was an economic backwater, already falling behind many the other parts of the United States. But it was recognized that it had a good climate and the labor force to grow certain crops that would be very profitable, such as cotton. But the cotton that you could grow in the South couldn't be cleaned using the usual methods. So this was the machine that people attempted to develop for a while, and then finally a couple of prototypes came up, including Eli Whitney, who got the patent for it. And both the contemporaries and the historians are in great agreement that the cotton gin completely transformed the US South and led to a surge in cotton production. In fact, it became the biggest exporter of cotton in the world, and cotton exports were the engine that fueled the Industrial Revolution, with the British textile industry leading the charge. Many people made fabulous fortunes from this huge export increase, but the workers who were producing cotton weren't among them, because they were the enslaved black Americans who, of course, didn't have the ability to demand higher wages in competitive labor markets. And when the landowners wanted more labor from them, they would just use coercion. And in fact, exactly what happened even from the get-go, because large populations of slaves were moved to the further deep south where the cotton plantations were, and the conditions actually worsened for the majority of them, and not much evidence of improved living standards. What both of these examples illustrate is what you could say the importance of the institutional environment, or even more sharply you could say the role of power. So that's where the word power in the Power and Progress, the title of the book, comes from. Power is going to play a role in how the gains are distributed and whether this critical step for the productivity bandwagon works. And of course, power has institutional as well as other roots. Power, as we'll see, also plays a critical role in the direction of innovation, which I'm going to talk about. So that's perhaps history, for many people, perhaps ancient history. And we might wonder whether it has any relevance to the digital age. Well, we'll come to the digital age, but before we do that, let's talk about an even more episodic event, which many people, even in the tech sector, draw parallels to, the Industrial Revolution. After all, when I said we are so much more comfortable than 300 years ago, I wasn't dating the 300 years to the windmill or anything like that, but I was dating it to the beginning of the British Industrial Revolution, sometime around 1750, with much more advanced technologies in factories that started being used. So some simplistic accounts of the British Industrial Revolution would say, look, we are all the beneficiaries for it, including the workers, so there is nothing to fear from technology. But when you look into the history of the British Industrial Revolution, a more complicated picture emerges. First of all, workers were not doing very well for much of the period, for about a year, for 100 years, and that had something to do with what I have already discussed, power issues. Workers were often without any options. They could not be represented. Trade unions were very heavily prosecuted. Collective negotiations and things like that weren't feasible. And laws were very much against workers, including, for example, people being sent to jail for quitting their employers and looking for better jobs. But there was something even deeper than that, and that's really about the nature of technology. The early technologies of the Industrial Revolution are what we today refer to as automation. Substitution of machines, and today would be machines and algorithms, for tasks previously performed by workers. And what we saw is that this sort of automation didn't necessarily lead to the optimistic productivity bandwagon type forces. And in fact, there shouldn't be a surprise for that, because when we go back to the first presumption that the productivity rises, and that means firms want to go and hire more labor, that isn't an unquestionable hypothesis either. What you learn in economics from the first lecture is that what the firms are willing to pay for workers and how much they're willing to hire is related to labor's contribution to production. So what economists call marginal productivity, or marginal productive labor. Whereas when we say productivity rises, that means how much you produce given the amount of labor. That means average productivity. There are reasons to suspect that average productivity and marginal productivity may co-move. One increases, the other increase. But there are also reasons to suspect that they don't. And I think if you want to understand that, since Mario told a joke, let me tell a joke too, or it's a sort of a story that captures the essence of that, which is a utopian or dystopian view of the future. And it says, well, I don't know who this goes back to because many people claim ownership for this. It says the future factory will have 2 employees, a man and a dog. The man is there to feed the dog, and the dog is there to make sure the man doesn't touch the equipment. So if that's your view, that's your idea of utopia, that's fine. It may not be so good for labor. It may not be so good for labor precisely because this joke's essence is that the productivity bandwagon doesn't work. You can increase productivity by going more towards that factory, or that factory's equipment gets better and you now produce twice as much output. And the joke is, of course, you don't need the man and the dog. They're completely dispensable. And if the productivity increases twofold, no factory is going to rush to hire more men and their dogs. What this example captures is essentially equipment eliminating the need for workers and driving a wedge between marginal and average productivity. And that's exactly what we saw in the first half of the British Industrial Revolution for a period that probably extended to 90, even 100 years. Only it was in the late 1840s, mid to late 1840s, that you see consistent wage increases, and it's only in the 1870s, 1880s that you see conditions for the workers start improving, not coincidentally with trade union recognition and negotiations for better pay as well as better conditions. So that is both a technological story and an institutional story. Again, you might not be so interested in these stories because you think they are history, and okay, fine, perhaps some tech gurus use the Industrial Revolution to justify their disruption, but okay, fine, forget about it. We live in modern times that are different. Well, are modern times really different? Yes and no. Actually, there are some remarkable similarities and remarkable differences. The differences actually can be seen especially in the 50s, 60s, 70s, in the United States, in France, in Germany, in many other countries. But let me show you data from the US, which is the one that I know best. And what I'm doing here is I am plotting the real wages, so inflation-adjusted wages for 10 demographic groups, men and women, and 5 education groups, all the way from workers without a high school degree to those with a postgraduate degree in dark blue. What you see, and everything is normalized to 0, so you can follow the cumulative increases in real wages. So from 1963, when these data start, to the mid to late 1970s, you see a period of remarkable shared prosperity. All 10 demographic groups are experiencing growing real incomes, and relatively rapid. If you extend this series with other sources to the 1940s, you see even faster growth and faster yet for lower education groups. So this is indeed a period of relatively equalizing growth where the bottom of the wage distribution is growing. And it's growing very fast. So the average between 1949 in the United States and 1975 is about 2.5 percentage points a year inflation adjusted, which means, you know, in 30 years, essentially you double your real earnings. So you can sort of move into the middle class quite easily with income growth like that. So that's the kind of shared prosperity experience that many countries around the world, especially in the West, but a few outside of the West, had in the 3 or 3.5 decades that followed. And in France, those were the glorious 3 decades. But they were glorious in other parts as well. But around 1980, perhaps a little bit before, you see a completely different pattern set in. There's a gyring divergence between top and the bottom, but the reason why I'm showing these as cumulative is that you also see that the red and the orange, high school graduates, high school dropouts, their real incomes are actually declining during this time period. So this is a period of about 30 years in which a large fraction of the population, far from benefiting from economic growth, actually saw their real inflation-adjusted incomes decline. So modern times could be different, like the shared prosperity, but there is some parallel between what we're seeing here, or especially in the United States, but there is some similarity in the UK as well. Some notable inequities accompanying rapid, disruptive technological and social change. Now, this pattern is not the same everywhere. So here is data from the, and since time is running short, let me just focus on the left. I'm going to skip the right picture. So this is data from Sweden. During the same period, or at least the latter half of that period, the blue line, which is wage inequality in Sweden, is actually declining. So Sweden is subject to the same technologies, same globalization, but it paints a much more complicated picture. Wage inequality is declining, but overall inequality is increasing in Sweden. Overall inequality is increasing partly because of hours changes, but partly also because capital income and other things that may or may not be influenced by globalization. So already the notion that I'm going to come back to again and again, that there are some choices that different countries make differently about who will win and who will lose, you can see that whenever you compare two countries and how they have fared during this time period. All of this then begs the same question. How was it that shared prosperity took place, or shared growth, not that low education people had the same income and there were some hardship, but how was it that income growth that was relatively evenly shared took place in the decades following World War II in the United States, in Europe, in the UK? Or how was it that it started taking shape in the second half of the 19th century in the British Industrial Revolution? And how did it become undone in the 1980s? My account for that is exactly related to the two pillars for the shared prosperity mechanism that I highlighted. Power that's equally distributed between workers, or at least not very unevenly distributed between workers and businesses, so that we do not have the kinds of situations that you see with European serfdom in the Middle Ages, or the enslavement and the slave plantations in the US South, for example, and a direction of technology that doesn't just automate, but also creates other technological opportunities for the productivity of labor, for the contribution of labor to the production process to increase. And you can see that, for example, in the auto industry in the United States, already laying the seeds of the post-war developments starting in the 1910s. The picture at the top is from one of Henry Ford's early factories. It's the Rouge plant in Michigan. Henry Ford was a pioneer in introducing assembly lines, electric machinery, high productivity mass production. And you can see that already in the Rouge factory, which is this flat organization. The cars were moved around, and there were these decentralized electrical machinery that were doing things that, previously workers were only able to perform. So that's the automation part. And automation is not a new phenomenon. It's not just something we see with digital technologies, and it will always be with us. Nothing I will say here is against automation. But what you see in the Henry Ford factory is that automation wasn't the only game in town. It was combined with a lot of new technical tasks for workers. So all of the workers you see around the cars are performing critical functions, and there is actually an army of other workers at the back doing repair, maintenance, bookkeeping, lots of engineering, clerical tasks. This is the reason why, as mass production was setting in, employment in Ford factories and employment in the auto industry was booming as well. So automation was coupled with other technologies that created new tasks for workers so that they became reallocated to more technical, more high-paying activities, as some of those earlier activities that they used to perform is taken over by machines. This balance between new tasks and automation is both organizational and technological. You need to have the technologies to do it. That's why it's about the direction of technology, and it's about organizations as well. And Henry Ford decided to do this, not because he was a friend of labor, far from it, but because he saw that increasing the productivity of labor was the best way of increasing his own bottom line. But he wasn't alone in that. The car industry was also the hotbed of union activity. So that's a picture from the United Auto Workers sit-down strike from a GM plant. There were earlier sit-down strikes and other strike activities in Ford operations as well. And the strengthening of unions was an important part of workers getting a fair share from the productivity increases, and the car industry was a leader in that, as well as in the use of electrical machinery, and unions spread from the car industry to other industries in the subsequent years. These two forces are remarkably similar when you look at the second phase of the British Industrial Revolution. It was also a change in the direction of technology, away from just automation to finding ways of increasing the productivity of labor, and a more balanced distribution of power within factories and within societies. That's very good. Thank you. Yeah, this is. I don't know what this is, but I had a mild cough 5 months ago, and then this cough comes back sometimes when I give talks. So, if it is these two pillars that undergirded shared prosperity, you wouldn't be surprised that my account says it was also the undoing of these two pillars that is at the root of the huge increase in inequality and the very unshared nature of economic growth in the United States and in many other industrialized nations over the last 4 decades. Here is what a car factory today looks like. It has gone much farther in automation, but you don't see the workers like you did in the Ford factory. There's only that chap there, and he's probably like a PhD or something. But the manual workers who used to do the production, they have significantly declined in numbers because robots have been very much targeted at automation with no corresponding changes in other technologies creating new tasks for workers. Now, This is not perhaps a statement that you will have seen, because many of you may have encountered the increase in inequality in the United States and may have heard about other potential explanations. So let me show you one more chart to underscore the importance of automation. So what I'm doing here is based on my work with Pascual Restrepo. I'm trying to give a summary of the wage inequality changes in the United States and relate them to automation. So now each one of these dots is a more detailed demographic group. In the previous picture, I was showing you by gender and education. Now it's gender, education, ethnicity, and age. You see the color coding telling you the education. And rather than showing you the time series of the up and down of inequality, on the vertical axis, I am plotting the change in the real earnings of each demographic group from 1980 to 2016. And you see the zero line there. And about half of the dots are below the zero. Thank you. So that, again, emphasizes the non-shared nature of economic growth. About half of the demographic groups didn't really much benefit from that spectacular growth on the digital age. But more interestingly, on the horizontal axis, I have our measure of automation, which is essentially what fraction of tasks that a demographic group used to perform have since been automated. So for many low education groups, high school graduate men, young men especially, they used to do a lot of blue-collar tasks in places like Ford and GM factories. Well, those have been automated. For some female groups, some office jobs have been automated. And you see a remarkable relationship between automation and inequality, accounting for about 60 to 70% of the wage inequality changes. But what this says is that inequality and the breakdown of shared prosperity was a technological necessity. Far from it, because my emphasis is that how we use technology, how we develop technology, and how we put the organizations around it is very much a choice. And it is in this choice that institutions and power become particularly important. So there are many changes that happened since the 1980s, but I want to zero in on two of them. One, because it shows the parallel to the building of shared prosperity. Labor movement became much weaker in the United States. That was perhaps an inevitability because deindustrialization had already started a process of weakening of unions, but it did get an additional kick when President Reagan fired the striking air traffic controllers, and then many other companies took the cue from Reagan and took a much harsher line against labor, leading to a faster decline in the power of unions. But another trend has been as important. It isn't just technology and hard power that matters. The ideas and norms of powerful actors, for example, CEOs or business leaders or policymakers, also have very great importance. The model that Ford developed unwittingly, he wasn't a big fan of it, but he was perhaps forced into it, is what some institutional economists of the earlier 20th century called welfare capitalism. Firms do well, and then they share the gains with their workers. They share the gains because unions force them to. They share the gains because they think that's going to motivate the workers, and they share the gains because that's just a fair thing to do. And a different sort of ideology emerged in the 1980s. And just like many other ideological revolutions, it has many fathers, but let me single out Milton Friedman because he was very vocal on this. His most famous work was not in an academic journal, but was in the New York Times Magazine, where he argued the only social responsibility of business is to increase shareholder value, which meant in particular that business leaders should be encouraged to reduce payments to labor. If they don't need to, why should they pay more? That means more for shareholders. And also a drive for reducing labor costs, which were the most important component of cost, which of course means automation. Business ideology leads to more automation. Well, one bulwark against that would have been the labor unions, but the labor unions are in decline, so they can't resist it. So you have these two forces going together. But there is a third force that perhaps, at least in my assessment, is no inferior to the other two. You may want to do all the automation that you want and you have no resistance, but if you don't have the tools for automation, you're not going to be very successful. But there was a willing industry providing those tools, the tech industry. And the tech industry, especially around the late 1970s and the 1980s, got into a mindset which today we see amplified, and so it is of great relevance in my assessment, at least for AI, which is about what technology should do, especially what digital technology should do and what AI should do. And it goes back to the thinking of that very great mathematician Alan Turing, who was a truly mathematical trailblazer, but his philosophy, I think, wasn't quite to the same level of mathematics. And Alan Turing was also trying to conceptualize what it is that machines should do, can do, and how to compare that to the human mind. And he jumped to the conclusion that A, computers work just like the human mind, or perhaps the human mind works just like the computers that he had in mind, and that it was a desirable process as a result for computers, digital tools, to take over more and more tasks from humans as they get better. Ultimately, if you have the universal Turing machine, it can do all the cognitive tasks that the human brain does, because he thought that the human brain is nothing other than just a Turing machine. That was the perspective that the AI community swallowed hook, line, and sinker. So that venerable group of gentlemen who were the people who christened the field of AI in 1956 in the Dartmouth Conference had exactly that perspective. Artificial intelligence is that branch that should develop autonomous machine intelligence. Machine intelligence, machines doing things like humans, and autonomous meaning that it should do that in a self-acting manner. And of course, if you have that, what it means is a very strong force towards automation. If machines are already doing things like humans, and they're going to get better and better, well, we should give them more tasks and take them away from humans. And it doesn't create a natural driver to lead us towards more new tasks for humans, to expand human agency, human capabilities. The problem is that I think this perspective, at least before the age of AI, has not been that successful. The age of innovation is upon us, led by digital tools, but the productivity gains aren't there. So if you look at the economist's favorite measure of productivity, total factor productivity growth, the digital age, in orange there, is much slower in terms of productivity growth than earlier decades. And this is not just confined to the United States. You see the same pattern in other industrialized nations. And the reason, I think, is this overdrive for automation, which isn't just problematic, as I have argued, for its distributional effects, but if you overdo automation, if you in particular substitute machines for human tasks when you shouldn't, then you're not actually going to get the productivity benefits. You're going to get a lot of this sort of lazy automation, or what Pasquale Restrepo and I called socio-automation. Yeah, a few more bucks for the companies because they save labor costs, but No productivity revolution, no improvements in product quality. It's like automated customer service or self-checkout lines that don't work. Now, will AI change that? No, I don't think so. But we'll come back to that in the conclusions. But of course, talking of digital technologies and AI, just as an economic phenomenon isn't enough. They are information tools, and as information tools, they influence every aspect of our social lives, including democratic participation or political participation. Surveillance is only one aspect of how AI and other related tools, especially computer vision tools, are going to influence the political landscape. It's much broader than that because it is about information control. Everybody, I think, at least in the West, recognizes the problematic nature of the picture at the bottom, which is an example of the social credit system in China that's already been implemented, where you have to go and check for your social credit before you go to the next machine and you can buy a ticket. But the picture at the top is not much better. Instead of the Chinese government controlling information, now private companies collect, control, and process that information for their own objective. And if the other arguments that I've made say there is no necessary overlap, complete alignment between the interests of companies and the interests of workers and the society at large, why should there be when it comes to information control? This is a topic that requires much longer discussion. Time is short, so I'm not going to get into it. But I want to conclude by talking about something slightly more hopeful. So I have pointed out problems related to institutional power changes and changes in the direction of innovation. But I don't want to create the impression that this is a trap out of which escape is not possible. As I have already stressed, the theme that I want to repeat over and over again is that choice is critical. We choose which type of institutions we live under. We choose the direction of innovation. Well, at least we have some say in theory about the direction of innovation. And what's wrong with this picture is that this picture is just emblematic of we as a society giving up that choice and leaving it to a debate between just two somewhat flawed individuals decide which one's going to dominate the future age of AI. Where is society? Where are workers? Where is democracy? I think that is a critical question. And that can, of course, not happen unless we have the politics of shared prosperity working, which means countervailing powers. The welfare capitalism, or whatever you want to call it, didn't happen by itself. It happened with unions, as I have emphasized. It also happened with civil society organizations, like Ralph Nader's organization, that led to a lot of the regulations about consumer safety. And it worked with regulations, government regulators themselves. But critically, the key for shared prosperity that I want to leave you with is the direction of innovation. It is impossible to build shared prosperity if all tools push for automation and centralization of information in the hands of companies. But that is a choice. It is very interesting that at every stage of the digital revolution, there were people who believed that A, it was feasible, and B, sometimes it was likely that digital tools would play a decentralizing, democratizing role. For example, Ted Nelson, at the beginning of the PC age, was a political activist and a technologist who thought that large companies, IBM was his main bugbear, but of course he didn't know Microsoft, it didn't exist yet, were killing the technology because they were exploiting it the wrong way, and a different way was possible, and he was optimistic that it could be reached. Ted Nelson never came up with technological breakthroughs. But actually, several other people did. And they provide a much better template for the kinds of AI that we want, in my opinion. So when, at the same time, as Alan Turing was writing about his views about mind, computers, and the future, another gentleman, Norbert Wiener, an important mathematician and engineer, was writing about the same thing. As early as 1949, Norbert Wiener was worried about robots automating work, what that would imply for workers, for wages. And he outlined a different view of what technology should do, which in the book with Simon we call machine usefulness, to contrast it with machine intelligence. Machines should be at the service of humans, expand human capabilities and human agency. Norbert Wiener himself was a theoretical engineer, never came up with technologies to do that, but several other people did. Douglas Engelbart and his students in the 1950s and 60s already made many breakthroughs which we take completely for granted today. The mouse, that was Engelbart's mouse. Menu-driven computers, hyperlink, hypertext, all of those came from Douglas Engelbart, and his students actually expanded all of these things. They did not come out of a vision where we should automate at all costs. In fact, Douglas Engelbart also wrote about human-machine complementarity. J.C.R. Licklider, who could be viewed as the father of the internet because he actually designed and supported the development of it in the ARPA, had exactly the same idea. He called it man-machine symbiosis. So these were the thinkers who thought that we could expand tools in a way that would be useful for humans to do more. And AI, if done right, could go in that direction, because AI as an informational tool could actually give more capabilities for many people rather than just automation. But again, related to the politics of innovation, it's not the direction that we are going in. All of this might strike some as wishful thinking, that somehow I am saying, well, all of these amazing geniuses in Silicon Valley don't know what's best for society, and we here as analysts from the outside can have a different view of what's perhaps better, and government regulation and societal pressure could change that. And some people, many economists, would say that's just fanciful thinking. But it's not as fanciful as you might think. One example illustrates it very powerfully, the energy sector. You could say the same thing. Those geniuses should know what's best, and they did what they thought was best, which was build and build and build more fossil fuel technologies. Of course, they didn't take that into account, that fossil fuel technology is very profitable for them. We're not going to be good for society. And it took a modicum of government regulations, subsidies for green innovations, and societal pressure to completely change the picture. As recently as the late 1990s, early 2000s, renewable technologies were 20 times as expensive for producing electricity, but we had tremendous technological progress and learning by doing, and today they're actually cheaper than fossil fuels for the electricity grid. And I think what was done, and what was lately done, but too late perhaps, for the energy sector, I think is as imperative when it comes to digital technologies and AI. Thank you.
you. Thank you so much, Daron, for this amazing tour de force, as we say in French, of analysis, historical analysis, economic analysis, information, data, evidence, just to say that we have options. And that the way these technological revolutions happened are not done in a vacuum and should not be done in a vacuum. So let us open the session of question and answers for Daron. I have to say that not only the managing of social transformation that is looking into these issues agrees with you, but member states agreed with you because they have given us this mandate of looking at the ethics of artificial intelligence, which is exactly to show or to look what decisions, what policies, what investments, what incentives can change the business model. So when we saw your work, we said, oh my God, but he got so many answers, which is good. So I'm going to give the floor to Simon ready to take the floor. Maybe it will be good to introduce yourself and then to ask the question. Maybe we go for 3 questions or, okay?
Thank you, Gabriela. Thank you, Daron, for a fascinating expose of the long durée of inequality and its intersection with innovation and technology. Gabriela, thank you also. Mario had a chance to introduce Daron and the ideas behind this. Thank you also from me for the opportunity to ask a first question and really put the thinking of Hirschman into the frame here, because Daron, your lecture and the book, but particularly your lecture and your words this evening, bring to my mind a piece of Hirschman's work from 1973, right bang smack in the middle of your arc of transformation there, which he called the changing tolerance of income inequality. And that's the piece in which Hirschman puts forward a very famous example that he calls the tunnel effect, which is the idea that what really matters about inequality for us as any one individual or group or class is how others are doing relative to us. And in that, he says, if you are in a tunnel, in a 2-lane tunnel, and you're sitting there on the side that's not moving, it's a problem when the other side move. It can initially be a hope. It can be an incentive for you to do more because maybe you're going to move shortly afterwards as well. But then if you don't move, the frustration becomes incredible. And towards the end of your lecture there, you gave us an insight and a hope for how these things work, which picks up on another of Hirschman's idea, which is this idea of iterative intersections between the forces of technology and ownership and power, and the response to that, the counter from those that want to reclaim that power. And you mentioned that the most efficient form of productivity growth, the one that gives us real innovation, is in fact one where workers and others push back, reclaim, and find ways to co-produce. And so my question really is to get you to think forward on this track. Do you see hope in AI providing the sorts of value that is not economic value, but which is social value, and which is the value that comes from individuals being able to explore options, to realize their capabilities, to together work and find meaning in what they labor on? You know, in the 1960s and 70s, there was a movement here in France, autogestion, which was about taking control of the means of production. You can't do that today. But it was also about finding meaning in the labor. So with AI, what are the prospects for the everyday man and woman on the street to find meaning? Because that's really where a lot of the innovation and a lot of the future productivity growth comes from. Thank you.
What a question, Simon. Any other question? Please.
Hello, my name is Charles McIver. I work on the OECD on mission-oriented innovation policy about directing technologies towards social goods. So this was a very interesting lecture and something I found very enlightening. So thank you very much for that. You talked though about creating. You talked though about. Sorry. Okay. You talked. I am. Keep stop. Oh, this one maybe. You talked about creating tasks, and I think that looking at your graphs, I was unsure if you could add a little bit more nuance there, because I think that there is in lots of them, you show how it's the low-educated people that keep losing out. And I think when I think about the sharing of productivity growth earns, it's often not just to people who are doing the jobs from before. It's not just demand for more labor, but it's demand for new high-skilled labor and demand for people who can do new types of tasks. And I think about the example of women who used to be typists, which used to become a medium-skilled job, and when those were automated, that was a real impact on middle-income jobs for women. And so then, is there a nuance in the types of tasks and the types of things you think we should be aiming for in terms of this middle-income job, but the education level, I think, really was a glaring thing throughout your presentation.
A third one. You go.
Thank you. Hello. Hi. Hi, my name is Fabio. Thank you so much for the great discussion, everybody, and thank you very much for sharing your insights. Super interesting and important. I'm an investment manager working on sustainable topics, and actually I'm an old fellow economist. I did my PhD at the London School of Economics some years ago, so thank you so much also for sharing the knowledge back then. My question is, when I see at your discussion about how technology innovation might impact society, and also the last message on, for example, the energy transition, my question is, do you think that the driver for a better outcome should be driven by national, international institutions, so politics, or should be also an argument that comes from ethics, from the bottom up? What is your stake on this? Thank you so much.
Fantastic questions. Well, first, thanks, Simon, for that wonderful placing of the work in Hirschman's thinking. That's very, very valuable. But your question and the question that followed are actually very related. And in fact, they are also the theme of or they are part of the theme of a new book I am working on, but not to see the light of day for another 5, 6, 7 years. I'm not saying that it is easy to get there, because it's a political, norm-related, social, as well as a technological choice. But I do believe that it is possible to use AI, which is an information technology, to amplify the skills, capabilities, and social meaning of work for a diverse range of skills, not just highly skilled workers who are college graduates, but workers with different types of skills. Let me give you an example. I don't know how it is in France, something I should find out, but in the US, there's a real shortage of electricians. And actually, electrician wages aren't low. But if you ask people in the United States, what is a high prestige occupation, they don't count electricians in. 50, 60 years ago, that was very common. If you ask people, what are the kinds of things that you want your children to go into, these craft work were high at the end, almost as close to being a medical doctor. Today, just a big chasm. That work is not valued, even though there's a shortage, and society doesn't invest in it. But actually, my dream, which I think is technically feasible, is that AI is a tool for electricians as well. So if you want to be a better electrician, you need better information. If you are the best electrician in the world, you can troubleshoot very complex problems. And the complex problems are getting more complex, and they're going to get even more complex with the electricity grid and much more diverse and complicated machinery. But being trained to be that best electrician is very difficult, and most electricians aren't there. So they can't deal with a lot of the complexities, but that's where an informational tool is very useful. But notice two things that are very different about this compared to the kind of AI that's being invested and developed today. First of all, it is not a general bot or a pretense of artificial general intelligence. It's a very domain-specific tool that tries to understand problems related to a specific electrical problem and provides reliable is very important, and context-dependent information for decision makers, in this case electricians or carpenters or plumbers. The second thing is that to do this, the AI and the tech sector should value those tasks socially, which will then of course help individuals themselves value those tasks more, not just the high level, very analytical tasks. So the idea that again goes back to Turing and Minsky and other leaders of artificial intelligence is that AI should do and can do almost everything that humans do except what they do, which is the programming and leading AI. And that is the perspective that I think has become more and more dominant, that there is only one type of skill, this very high analytical abstract skill related to computer programming, etc., that's very valued. All the other skills are less valuable. And that, of course, has both inequality and social implications. And I don't think the historical record supports that. So if you look in the 50s and the 60s, there were a lot of new tasks for low education workers. It's no surprise that there were, because that is the period where inequality really collapsed. Now, skills were critical, but they weren't college skills. Training was the mechanism via which many of these workers acquired the know-how to work with those new tasks and new technologies. So I think we need a more multidimensional educational approach as well that emphasizes training and different types of skills, but only if both the social valuation of those skills and the technologies are helpful there. And coming to your question, I think the issue here is about what types of institutions are going to support the transition in these areas. And again, recognizing the importance of that transition in climate, in digital technologies, in healthcare, where one very important dimension of those inequalities is, for example, not investing enough in public health, and then developing the social and technological solutions for them. But again, the institutional framework and recognizing of these problems will have to be a central part of that.
Thank you so much. I'm going to bring some gender balance. I think you raised your hand, so take the floor. And we'll take this question, another one, and then we will close. It has been an amazing journey, but we will need to finish. So,
hi, thank you so much. Am I audible? I think I am. I'm from Turkey. I'm actually working for Turkish İş Bank in their artificial intelligence program. And I was wondering, and I'm also a law student, and I'm interested in the legal aspect of this. Now the EU has an AI Act, and the UN is working on a convention on the use of AI. I was wondering how you evaluate those, let's say, those aspects when it comes to supporting the equality and prosperity. Thank you.
Anybody else? Here is.
Does it work? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I'm Sergio Benevides from the delegation of Brazil, and I was curious about how can we try to reach a different power balance in a world in which unions are as they are now, and in which the work seems more atomized, if I may say so, instead of collective, as it was in the era of some transformations that we saw in past phases of industrial revolution. Thank you very much.
So, last one. Okay, yeah, first.
Last one.
Thank you very much. I am from the delegation of Peru. I have a brief question. I understood that most of your the proposition, the theory that you have offered us works very well in more developed countries. I was thinking most in emerging economies like Peru, where a large proportion of their economy works in the informal area with a low productivity, very low productivity in a big area of the economy, with little connections with the digital economy. And so my question is, what is your vision about if the AI is going to worsen the situation of the labor in this kind of economies, or what is your perspective about it? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. The last two questions actually bring something I wanted to say in response to Flavio's, but I didn't. Fabio's question, but I didn't want to take longer, so I didn't. But this is also what we were talking about with Gabriela. It is imperative that the developing world has a voice in AI, because AI is going to remake the global division of labor. It's going to be used in every country. China, for example, as a leader in surveillance technologies and is exporting all of these surveillance technologies to around the world, many non-authoritarian, some democratic countries. So the citizens of the developing world are already subject to AI in many different ways, but their perspective, what they need, is not reflected. So I think having an organizational structure that deals with that is critical. And it requires that institutional and the norm change that Fabio was also hinting at. But the problem of the developing countries is more complex, because they have to both catch up to the technology frontier and also have their voice and perspectives reflected in the direction of AI. And I think that's also relates to your excellent question about, EU and the legal framework. I think the legal framework is something that we absolutely need to rethink. It relates to the ethics of AI. It relates to the failure of some of the existing legal frameworks. And I hope that sort of a more holistic thinking about what it is that we want from AI will be part of that. And in that context, I must say, I do believe the European Union, European Commission is playing an extremely valuable role in pushing back against some of the excesses of tech, and in fact, it has emerged as a leader in highlighting some of these issues. They haven't worked very well. For example, GDPR, which I think is very, very close to my heart, is very important, these data rights, but it was not a success. And I think the EU Act has some important elements as well. But two things. First, just like I said, for the developing countries, EU cannot just be a regulator of AI. It has to be an innovator of AI as well. So again, there is an element of catching up to the frontier. But the more important point that I think the EU Act misses, and other discussions in the US context also miss, is that they are reactive. They take AI as given, and then they say, how can we avoid specific harms? And they also take it as given that the path of AI is out of the control of the regulatory and the legal framework. But my argument from the talk, as I've tried to communicate, is that the direction of AI, as the direction of other technologies, is critical. And here we need voice from the developing world, voice from workers, and the legal framework to reflect it. And I think that is, part of a harder agenda to achieve. But I don't think it's hopeless. And just going back to your question, sorry, Sergio, about workers. Yes, the worker movement, labor movement, is much weaker than it used to be. But I think there is increasing recognition that if AI wipes out workers, not leading to mass unemployment, that's not going to happen anytime soon, it's not going to happen within the next 20 years, but if it reduces their essential role for production, reduces their ability to contribute to production in a meaningful way, it's going to be trouble. And you can see that in the United States, not the most labor-friendly country, but relative to where the debate was 5 years ago, now unions are much more central in AI discussion. I've been part of Senate hearings where labor representatives were there, no, not just big companies. And even more importantly, on both sides of the Atlantic, the labor movement itself has become much more centered on understanding AI, how it will affect its members, and how it can influence how AI is used and perhaps how AI is developed, which I think is an essential part of this process.
Thank you so much, Daron. This has been really an amazing conversation. I have to tell my dear members that I feel that with the work that we're doing on the ethics of artificial intelligence and the fact that we are producing these diagnostic tools for each country to decide how he wants to shape this technological drive in terms of their needs, in terms of their profile. We launched the Latin American and Caribbean Council for the Ethics of AI. And it was amazing because what I'm hearing, and you helped change that narrative, is that it is for governments to equip themselves better, for citizens, for unions to understand better, and then take the decisions of where this technology needs to go. And what we're hearing from Daron is that there is a way that could be different. We have the tools, we have the means to shape it different. Let me just finish this conversation because we cannot go without some reflection of what does this mean for our program. And I really want to invite Gustavo. I don't know if you want to make the closing. I will not make it because, but it will be fantastic if you share with us some of the views of how we are going to incorporate this. To Katya, to the family, I think you have seen this is not a technological discussion, it's a societal one, and it's about people. And this is what I like from the work of Daron. This is about people.
Thank you, Gabriela, and I would like to obviously thank and show my appreciation to Daron Acemoglu for his comments on this inaugural Albert Hirschman Lecture at UNESCO, and of course to the Hirschman family for being here and allowing us to use the name. Now, Daron has given us much to reflect on that resonates deeply at the core objectives of UNESCO's Management of Social Transformation Program, which is the one organizing this conference. And the MOST program is the acronym. The MOST program emphasizes the critical science policy nexus and the pressing need for evidence-based policies to manage complexities and social change. Now, for a very good reason, public problems are also described as wicked problems, given their complex nature and difficulty in finding a single solution, among other issues. There is no single path to address social challenges and public challenges, and all proposed solutions will have consequences, some of them unintended, and we really need to think about them before implementing them. And we live now in a world of unprecedented technological change, and this is a societal transformation that poses significant opportunities but also challenges. Professor Acemoglu is well aware of the benefits of technological progress, but his careful analysis and research on technological progress and prosperity makes a strong case to question the idea that technological progress is good for all always, the productivity bandwagon idea that he mentioned. Indeed, conventional wisdom can be wrong, and many of the benefits of technological progress have accrued to a few elites, exacerbating inequalities, but also increasing societal polarization and undermining democracy, as Daron has mentioned. So this is clearly not a rant against technological progress. which we all think it's important, but a serious reflection on how to ensure that it benefits all. And that in itself is a very valuable insight, but there is much more in Daron's analysis that is of value to the management of social transformations program. Let me highlight two key inputs that are relevant for addressing society's challenges that we take from this work. The first is that the final result is not preordained. There's a choice that society and government makes. That's what shapes the result. And the impact of technological progress and how it benefits society is shaped by institutions and incentives faced by producers and users of technology. Now, the existing business model of digital technologies and AI, as has been said, is heavily reliant on user data, enhances market concentration and power for the elites, and contributes to inequality, while facilitating surveillance and propaganda and undermining democracy. But governments can use policy and society and help in that to lead progress in a better direction through the judicious use and the judicious use of the means at the disposal, regulation, taxation, and incentives. And this applies not just to AI, it applies to all policy domains. The second insight is that how we define progress is key. It's very important. And this is a very important work for our work at the MOST program, at the Management of Social Transformation program. It pertains to finding better measurements to the traditional ways of understanding progress, whether it's at the macro level, such as going beyond GDP, which fails to consider environmental and social considerations, and fails also to look at future generations. But we also have to think how we define progress for businesses and how markets reward this progress. It cannot be based solely on profits, but should take into account societal and environmental issues as well, as Daron well reminded us in his mentions. This includes the impact on all stakeholders, including workers and users and clients. Now, the need for inclusive institutions, which is a recurring theme in another excellent book of Professor Acemoglu with James Robinson called Why Nations Fail, as well as the role of civil society, these inclusive institutions for civil society are fundamental for inclusive development and growth. On a personal note, ever since I read that book, Why Nations Failed, I've found his work fascinating and inspiring, and I hope I transmitted this to my graduate and undergraduate students at Tecnológico de Monterrey, where I taught, and I assigned the book in my syllabus. Daron, it's really a pleasure to have you at UNESCO. Thank you for your reflections and insights. Your talk was indeed exciting and thought-provoking way to inaugurate this Albert Hirschman Lectures at UNESCO, and it sets a high bar, but it's a high bar that corresponds well to the very great legacy of Albert Hirschman. Thank you. Yeah.